Dr. Gaines is a distinguished clinical professor of law at the UW Law School, and she is the director of the Center for Patient Partnerships, a patient-centered organization at the schools of law, medicine, nursing, and pharmacy. And I believe she has a very broad perspective on the patient approach to all of the diverse healthcare issues that people face. I'll give you Dr. Gaines. Thank you.
My microphone's very excited. Lawyers don't get called doctor very often, even though I suppose technically it's true. So, good morning, and thank you for having me, and for giving me the opportunity to drive up from Madison on this beautiful, gorgeous, sunny day and watch the geese fly over and get reminded again of how amazing it is to be alive. I thought I'd give you a little background on my why I'm here and why I do what I do and how I got involved in issues like engaging patients in research and how I got engaged in research myself, and why it's lovely to be reminded of how great it is to be alive. A funny thing happened to me on the way to my 40s. I come from a huge family with zero history of cancer, and when I was 38 with children that were 3 and 6 months, I was diagnosed with ovarian cancer, but not until my gynecologist had presumed it was a benign cyst, tried to remove it laparoscopically and burst it, making it recur in my liver 4 months later. That led to a chemotherapy regimen where I was, not my tumor, mind you, I was deemed platinum resistant, and eventually told to go home and think about the quality, not the quantity, of my remaining days. Needless to say, I didn't go home and, well, I did go home and think about the quality, but I didn't let the quantity thing go either, and wound up on a finding myself at the John Wayne Cancer Institute in Santa Monica, California, with a guy who was probably a little crazy, but so was I, who agreed to cryosurgery, what were then thought to be 12 to 25 tumors in my liver. When I was opened up and he did an intraoperative ultrasound, it was discovered only one tumor. There had only ever been one tumor, even though we'd been following somewhere between 3 or 12 or 25. And he froze it and thawed it, and that was 21 years ago. So here I am. When I got back to my job at the law school, the fact is that the job was the same and wonderful, but I was completely different. And so I began to do this kind of unofficial advocacy gig, because my oncologist would call me and say, I've got this lady, she's kind of down, I wonder if you'd come talk to her. And because I'm a lawyer and nosy and all those things that lawyers are, people began to say things like, well, my doctor says I need to be here for 5 days, but my insurance company's only willing to pay for 3. And I said, give me that, let me call them, and started what I refer to as my knight in shining armor phase of advocacy. That lasted for a while until I realized that, there weren't going to be enough advocates in the world to actually climb up the backside of healthcare, and that we were going to actually have to make healthcare professionals into advocates for their patients. And that, of course, is much more complicated than it sounds. It's not just teaching a skill set, it's also reforming a system so that healthcare professionals can be advocates for their patients. And so that's the sort of holy alliance or unholy alliance that we have at the Center for Patient Partnerships with healthcare professionals to try to change the system and bring the patient voice into the clinic rooms, into the boardrooms of organizations, and into the halls of Congress as we change healthcare across the system. So now you know a little bit about me and how I backed into this work. And in the course of the last 15 years, I've done quite a bit as a patient partner in research before I even knew there was sort of such a thing as engaging patients in research. I sit on the NCI Cancer Research Advocates Board, which I'm actually going to a meeting Monday and Tuesday. We advise the director of the NCI on research policy and practice in the cancer domain. I'm going this afternoon actually to Boston. I've sit on a Department of Defense funded grant at Harvard and Mass General to learn more about long-term cancer survivorship for ovarian cancers, and they have an advocate advisory board, which you'll hear a little bit more about in a minute. But I think it's fair to say we've influenced this grant systematically and somewhat importantly in direction. I'm on a research team that's trying to discover a tool that patients and physicians can use to try to make the surgery decision in older adults in the context of high sort of trauma situations like aortic aneurysms and things like that. And then I'm also been working with a epidemiologist, a hospital epidemiologist at the University of Wisconsin to develop patient-generated tools to try to control hospital-acquired infections. So I've had a fair amount of experience. I thought you should know a little background from whence to put my remarks in context. Sorry. So the timing of this is, as most of you know, and I'm aware that not all of you are either enjoy or are seeking PCORI funding, but you're all, I think, interested in patient-centered outcomes research, whether you do that with funding from the institute or not. But it seems important to at least put it in the context of an institute that is, as you all know, heavily funded and providing lots of funding opportunities. But they require fulsome engagement of patients and have chosen intentionally to be silent as to how that is, and also not to fund efforts to develop knowledge about how best to engage patients. PCORI has made a distinctive decision to stay apart from the sort of secondary development of sort of how do you do this? How do you engage patients effectively? What works? What doesn't? So that leaves those of you and those of us seeking PCORI funding a little on our own to find our ways and to develop the kind of shadow research of how do you do this and how do you do it effectively. And engaging patients is in fact foreign, complicated, and time-consuming. And as an organization that consults with people who engage patients quite a bit, I will say that we're already in what I would call phase 2, which is we're doing sort of phase 1 and phase 2 at the same time, which is we're still consulting with people who've never done this before and are coming to us and saying, how can we do this? How can you help us do this? We don't know what we're doing. And we're also now consulting increasingly with people who say, ugh, we tried it. It didn't work. It was horrible. But we got to try again because we need this funding, or we want to go this way, or we know it's the right thing to do. I mean, a variety of reasons. But so we're actually thinking about and working on developing ways to sort of unpack people's negative experiences and kind of repurpose and reposition. And that, of course, involves whole groups of research teams who have incurred painful kind of experiences together, and it has a tendency to sometimes to divide people on a team because they have, as failure does. So we are talking about how can we maximize the possibility of successful collaborations, and why, what, when, who, and how to engage patients effectively. So that's kind of what I hope to talk a little bit about this morning. Beginning with why engage patients in research, because that seems important. And I think because it is essential to success. I really think that this is perhaps the most important building block of this. If you don't actually believe that a patient's input, or patient's input, broad writ, is mission critical to research, don't bother engaging us because it's not going to work well. We are essentially barnacles on the backside of your research project. It doesn't work well for anybody. And that's a much more powerful statement. I mean, I can't make that statement powerfully enough. Usually that's not my problem. But I can't make that statement powerfully enough because I think 100% of the problems we encounter with people who have made efforts to engage patients is that not that they don't necessarily believe it's important, but that they haven't done the work to really articulate as a team why it's important, and to make sure that the whole team gets that. Because engaging patients is not going to be easy. You know, I don't want to make this parallel publicly, but I'm just about to. It's a bit like raising adolescents. If you don't really know that on the other end of it there's something really good, then no one would ever do it, right? Except that you have no choice, which is kind of the PCORI, right? So we're in a way in that same batch. There's a lot to endure for everyone. And when we're raising adolescents, I don't really mind the parallel that much, apparently. When we're raising adolescents, it's not just the adolescents who behave funky, we do too, right? Parents do too. And so it's a bit like that, and you have to really be able to go to your talisman of why this is important. And you have to be able to go there as a whole team and remind yourself when the going gets tough why this matters. And commit to being honest, saying what's happening, shifting if you need to, adding, moving things around. So it increases, it is essential to success, I think, and not unlike having patients engaged in their own healthcare is essential to success, if success means anything in a clinical way. Because if healthcare is really if at least illness care is sort of taking the treatment options and taking the patient's value systems and quality of life and beliefs and values and applying them together, putting them together to come up with the right treatment, right? If that's the goal, it's the same thing in research. It's bringing the patient kind of perspective, the consumer, the people who are going to be using this research or benefiting from it, arguably. That same connection needs to be made, I think. It increases accuracy, relevance, representativeness, effectiveness, implementation, and dissemination at all levels, I think. So what can patients offer to research? An accurate definition of the problem. I'm going to do some examples of all these in a minute, but of actually real life sort of applied situations. Patients can help. So patients can help say, no, 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 no. That's not entirely the problem, because what you don't know is this is what people are living with, and so that's why this is happening. And you're like, oh. And you would have now been 17 months down your research project before you figured out that the problem you've defined and the money, the grant project that was funded is now funded to do something that isn't actually what needs to be done. That's, as those of us who have gotten grants that turn out to be for the wrong thing, not a comfortable feeling. Patients can help identify relevant data, can suggest data collection methods, locations, and populations, can help collect data, can offer diverse perspectives in data analysis and interpretation, co-conceive and pilot interventions, interpret results, help refine interventions, suggest implementation strategies, and support publicity for implementation and dissemination. All of those things, patients can enhance research in all of those ways, I think, and probably others that you know of that I haven't thought of or seen yet. This is patient roles for PCOR and comparative effectiveness research. You'll see kind of goes through topic solicitation, and then it says purpose of patient engagement. I don't think this is conclusive or entirely inclusive, but I think it's a really helpful a chart so patients can identify topics that are important to patients, caregivers, in the community. They can propose topics to be investigated, solicit feedback on relevance and priority of topics, and you'll see all the way down there are ways that, specific ways that patients do and can help in all phases of research through translation and dissemination. When should patients be engaged? This is really important. This is a personal plea. I wish I had a nickel, since I do a lot of fundraising. I wish I had a nickel for every time someone called me and said, we have an LOI due tomorrow. Do you mind if we just put you on here? It's not going to obligate you to anything, but then could we just, I wish I had a nickel. And then it just happened yesterday. Then comes time for the grant, and they say, the grant's due next week, so could you just, can you write us a letter of support, and can you just, and we say, no, you actually can't have our name for, 5 hours of consulting where you're basically going to make us put our imprimatur on something we don't even think you're doing right. So no, you can't. And it is really, 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 really important, as I said, if you're going to engage patients in research in one of these projects, it's really important to get all in and to provide the resources in the grant proposal to get it right and to commit to the time and energy that it takes and the expertise that it requires. So from the very beginning and all the way through, I also wish I had a nickel for every time someone said, so we got this grant and we're going to do this and we're going to do this. Can you help us do a focus group? I mean, yes, I can help you do a focus group, but it doesn't, well, actually, I don't really do many focus groups, but it doesn't help us to come in sort of partway through. If I think the question's not right and that the whole topic of the research is probably missing the point, it sort of feels like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic to come in and help engage patients to talk about this now. Or we thought we'd do a board, an advisory board, and we're 6 months into the project already. That's a difficult time to do that. So from the start and all the way through, naming the right problem. So these are all examples of these particular areas. We were called in very late after a local clinic in Madison had already paid Epic for a change to their electronic medical records because they had chronic lateness problems with people from a certain part of town, don't you know? And so they had chronic lateness problems, so they'd asked Epic to make sure that all their patients got letters that said, if their appointment was at 10, that said, remember your appointment's at 9:45. So they were calling all their patients in 15 minutes early, took a big Epic expensive Epic edit to make this happen. And as you might imagine, most of the patients in the clinic were furious. They were waiting now for their appointments, and they knew their appointments weren't at 9:45, that they were at 10 o'clock. And so it created this firestorm for them. And they called us in, and of course, with just a little bit of interviewing and analysis of the data, we could figure out that it was about 5 families that were causing most of the lateness problems, and that the Madison bus system was routinely redirecting buses from that part of the neighborhood when traffic was heavy and they needed them on in other parts of town. So they would just cancel a particular bus without telling anyone that they were doing that. So this was actually a problem that could be solved with a much smaller intervention and with making sure that anyone who needed a taxi to get there on time could get a taxi there on time. But it was an enormous PR problem in the process. So an example of getting the right problem to begin with and asking patients' input on that is really important. Getting the right data. This Department of Defense grant that I sit on has a big quality of life piece to it. They're trying to find out how long-term ovarian cancer survivors become long-term ovarian cancer survivors and how they cope in the process. And they came to us with a quality of life survey, and the 10 of us sitting around the table looked at it, read it for a while, and then said, well, you're missing kind of a big piece. And they said, well, what's that? And we said, well, when you come back off of treatment and you've faced a life-threatening illness, reinvesting in hope, reinvesting as a parent, I don't want my kids to depend on me if my cancer is just going to recur and I'm going to die. I don't want to change. You know, they've already shifted their attention to a different parent or another person. I don't want to put them in that position. And reinvesting in intimate relationships, reinvesting in intimate sexual interactions, that requires a tremendous amount of hope and life affirmation. And when you've just sort of had the rug pulled out from under you, it's not an easy thing to get back into. Quality of life surveyors, experienced quality of life surveyors, nowhere on their radar screen. And the 10 of us are sitting around the table going, yeah, what are you, nuts? Yeah, of course we all had that experience. And it was a very interesting revamp of the quality of life survey, just one example of the impact I think that board has had. The other example is, many of you may or may not know this example, that Johnson & Johnson, or SC Johnson, or one of them anyway, was wanting to take, whoever it is that makes Glade, or no, not Glade, that bug spray, wanted to take the bug spray to Africa, and quite civilized, you know, well-developed parts of Africa where there was plenty of electricity and so on. They made sure of that. They did all the vamping, and so they got these little plug-in things that emit this gas, basically, invisible gas into the air, and they made sure there was electrical outlets, made sure this, made sure that, shipped a boatload, several boatloads of them over to these people in these countries, and gave them out to all these mothers who had mosquito netting over their kids' cradles, and mosquito netting was soaked in the same product, right? So they thought, perfect, just plug this in instead, and you don't have to have the fuss and bother of mosquito netting. Yeah, as soon as the women figured out that they were plugging something in which was emitting an invisible gas in their children's bedrooms, they said, no, we're not doing that. No, that's creepy. It's weird. So they have these warehouses of plug-in mosquito stuff just sitting there now because they won't use it, because they don't like the feeling. And they said to them, but your mosquito netting is soaked in. They're like, that's different. The mosquito netting doesn't touch the child, the this, the that. Doesn't, you know, right or wrong, it's about what, you know, consumers will and won't do and will and won't use. And if you only ask whether they can, that's a problem. Data collection. Again, this Advocate Advisory Board is an online goldmine for data collection. When the 10 of us who sit on this board, all of whom are associated with ovarian cancer survivorship in some way, when we send out this questionnaire, it has an enormous response rate, right? They're expecting in the single digits if they send it out sort of generally. But when it comes out from us, we have, you know, the initial signs are that they have a 60% response rate. So that's a significant bump, I think, to data collection and to the richness then of data. Data interpretation on this surgery tool research committee that I sit on, talking in focus groups to elderly folks about what they think about making decisions in the context of an exploding or imminently exploding aortic aneurysm. There were many things they said that the researchers sort of were confused by, like, well, why would you think that? And I found myself being able to relate to all of that, because if you've been in a life-threatening situation yourself, you just understand values differently. The surgeon who did my cryo asked my father at one point if I'd ever been treated for mental illness. My father's telling me this, and I said, really? Why did he ask you that? And he said, well, he didn't think you seemed to understand or appreciate the danger. There's a 50% chance you'll die on his table. And I started laughing hysterically, so much so that I rolled off we were in a hotel room, I rolled off the bed and started, you know, my father thought maybe I should be treated for mental illness at that. But he said, what's so funny? And I said, I find it amazing that a guy who does oncology surgery for a living thinks that the worst thing that could happen to me is to die on his table. That sounds amazing to me right now. It sounds heroic. I myself am thinking about dying in a rented bed in my living room on so much morphine I barely know anybody, with my kids avoiding me like I'm a monster. Dying on your table? What a gift. You don't know that if you've never been there. And you don't understand the things people say if you don't have the capacity to kind of relate to them. You need people around who've had those experiences to help you interpret that data. Designing interventions. The hospital-acquired infections work we do began with them getting a grant, and this is one of those ones where I was brought in late, getting a grant about hand washing, and particularly to get patients to say, you know, be more instrumental in saying, have you washed your hands? And I just said to them, look, you could maybe find a more activated patient than I am, but just ask my doctors. I am really annoying. I would never ask my doctor if she has washed her hands. Never. Wouldn't dream of it. And I don't expect them to ask me if I brushed my teeth this morning either. It's none of their business, and it's not mine. They are professionals, and I'm going to rely on the fact that they washed their hands, maybe to my detriment, but I'm still going to rely on it. If we're going to solve the hand washing problem, it's not going to be throwing it to patients and saying, here, you ask them. You know, that is not how it's going to work. So we redirected the nature of that project after it was funded to do something different. That's one of those. But, you know, sometimes you got to do what you got to do. The other thing we did, which I thought was really fun, my idea, they were trying to teach people about the signs of infection, and one of them was, of course, fever. So my idea, which we did, was to create these little cards that you open up. You know those cards you open up and they play music? So we created this series of instruction cards. One of them was about fever, and you open it up and it plays fever, fever, fever all through. They'll never forget that, right? Fever is a sign of infection. I heard the music. You know, I heard the song. So anyway, that was fun. That's also designing the intervention idea. Testing the intervention. The business about mosquito netting versus plug it in, I sort of already gave you that. You know, you think plug it in, yeah, not so much. And if you don't test it on people, real patients, then you won't know that. And if you don't have patients engaged in designing implementations, then you won't think to ask that question until you're a little too far along. Implementation, this is one of my favorite ones. It came quite late in the process, but again, another clinic in Madison, big new clinic, redesigned, fabulous, fabulous. There's going to be self-rooming in this new clinic, so they get the patients to, you know, walk themselves to their room. And so they've created these little clinic maps, and it's, you know, the week before opening, and we all go in to create these clinic maps, and they give us the maps. And we start to walk around and realize the maps are backwards. It's the whole thing backwards. So there was an interesting thing to realize before you actually open the clinic. And then dissemination, again, I told you the Advocate Advisory Board for this DoD grant has a newsletter that goes out to all the ovarian cancer pipeline, everything. So again, disseminating, gathering data, all that kind of stuff is tremendously advantaged by having access through patient gateways and portals. Who should be engaged? Please avoid the fantasy of a typical patient. There, A, aren't very many typical patients, and B, I think that typical is a problematic notion because what researchers benefit from is a fulsome, robust, and broad spectrum of infusion of patient perspectives. When you're worried about it's not typical enough, then you're not engaging enough patients. It's not that you should be able to find patient X who represents everybody, right? None of us represents, and that brings us to the representation trap. None of us represents anyone else unless we are expressly elected or appointed to do so. Patients can be engaged to help researchers better understand what patients, broad writ, might feel or experience, but no patient should labor under the unbearable weight of the duty to represent anyone. It's not realistic or useful. You should engage patients who are, well, safety in numbers is really important. The more patients you engage, the the more patients will feel able to talk and say what they think. That's important. Those who are interested and emotionally involved in the research question is what Mullins says, that it's important. That's a likelihood of success is linked to engaging patients who are interested and emotionally involved in the research questions. And then it depends on the task. So different patients will relate to and get excited about different research projects. And some are more interested in getting involved at the level of serving on a focus group panel. Others are more involved and interested in getting involved at the level of being on your research team. It just depends. It depends on the patient, it depends on the task, it depends on the level. Match patients and levels to the tasks. So it's a continuum, engage patients early and often. This is a modification, this is our modification, the center's modification of a Health Canada chart. So if you're looking for the original version of this chart, just Google Health Canada patient engagement chart. But you'll see that from the bottom up, I'll sort of take you through it. Patients, this is often what we do, we educate. So we inform or educate, so we push information out. And sometimes we gather information, so circles, surveys, cycle time, suggestion boxes, that's when we're taking things in from patients, right? Then sometimes we discuss with patients, so focus groups or interactive interviews, it's a back and forth. Up to involve, the fourth level, which is patients are ongoing advisors, so they're engaged in a regular matter when needed over the course of the project. And finally, you'll notice all the 5 little balls are the same size in the upper one, where patients are full participants, full research team members from the beginning and engaged all the way through. So these are the levels, help you think about sort of how to engage and on what level. We mix and match levels for different needs. If you just need a piece of information in the course of a project, you don't necessarily partner with a patient, right? You might discuss or involve, but you have to sort of plan that out and understand what it is you're hoping to get and match the level to the need. And different patients enjoy different levels and are able to do different levels. The higher the level, the richer and deeper the data, the more varied the input, the more preparation required, and the more transformational for everyone. And I want to underscore everyone. It is transformational for patients, but it is always transformational for research teams as well. And I don't use the word transformational lightly. I think it often reinvigorates people's passion for their work, which is no small transformation, I think, for people. How to engage patients. I can't overstate the importance of this, the intentionality of invitation. Before an invitation can be real and genuine and authentic, the team must have done the work necessary to attain a heartfelt belief that partners are mission critical to success. I said it at the beginning, I'll say it again. Before inviting, there's this work to be done. Valuing time is very important. Compensation does matter. Not always money, but I think wherever possible, and certainly wherever it involves any kind of a significant time, it should be compensated and it should be written into grants. No one else at the table is working for free, and I don't know why patients should do so. It can be tricky. Support for research, and there's an article about this in the end, which I have on a slide. Patients want to support research, but they also it's important to separate this out from sort of a desire for individualized care. So it's just important to make sure patients understand, and it's in the job description, and we'll talk about that in a minute, it's in their job description, that this is not your care. This is research, this is your care, they're separate, and we need to be grown-ups and prepared to talk about if that line becomes fuzzy, and we need to separate it out again, or someone needs to cry uncle and say, hey, this isn't working for us because we're getting a sense that you feel differently in the clinic, blah, blah, blah. You know, just the ability to talk about it's really important, and it begins up front. Thinking of the little things is really important. Childcare, travel, blood sugar level. By that I mean snacks. You know, if you're going to be sitting there for 2.5 hours, these are important things to consider, and they show that you're thinking about patients. I know patients who volunteer their time and then have to pay for their own parking, which I think is kind of crazy. It's important, I think, to have an intentional welcome, to have the whole staff ready and convinced and committed, and to be open, to all of us, for new ways of being together. So if typically, you know, one person runs all the meetings and is kind of the boss and this and that, you might actually want to think about this as an opportunity to rethink even how you are together at other times in your team. It's important to have agreement, a meeting of the minds between the patient and the whole team, a job description. In your materials that is in the book, there's a slide where I sort of made suggestions for job description. I won't go through all of them, but I think it's really important to have a written job description and not to identify patients until you have that description, but then keep the description flexible. Because over time you might say, you know, we don't really need you to do this, we need you more to do this, does that work, blah, blah, blah. But do that all intentionally and out in the open. And finally, patients who understand their roles are more effective. That's also from the Mullins article. I think that one thing I would point out from the slide that's in your book is the willingness to develop expertise in a broader patient perspective and to call on the team to do the same. A willingness to sort of say, wait a second, think again, you know, somebody who will speak up, particularly if they're involved at the engage level, the highest level. But Corey says that meaningful engagement means engagement in all aspects of research. This is their slide. They say it's the meaningful involvement of patients, caregivers, clinicians, and other healthcare stakeholders throughout the research process, from topic selection through design and conduct of research to dissemination of results. And I will maybe ask you at the end to talk about what is meaningful involvement, what has it meant to you, what experiences you have of it. This is a slide, again, it'll be in your materials, but this is a PCOR slide that I think is really good about sort of the elements of engagement, the actions that kind of bring those elements to bear, and the outcomes, near-term, intermediate, and long-term. And you'll see that in long-term is optimal health, which is kind of what, keeping our eyes on the prize. This was a patient. I often make people say which one's the patient, and I think it's hard to tell because Lois is actually the woman on the left, and I always think she looks like she has on a nurse's outfit. But anyway, she was engaged in her microsystem redesign team from the very start, and was also got her care in the clinic. And this is just a visual example of an extraordinarily successful engagement experience. The center has co-created materials that relate to engaging patients. They are up on the HIP Exchange. If you're not familiar with it, the URL is below. And we have toolkits. The team version of the toolkit, we also have a coach's version, which is longer and kind of more dense, but the team version is up on the HIP Exchange, as well as the patient welcome packet, and which helps you sort of put together a more concrete and clear welcome for your patients. We have other materials available from us that are listed here. These are some publications, a few that I've referenced, the Mullins article. I love alchemy. I just love the concept of alchemy. It's always intrigued me. And I think of this as, one of the definitions of alchemy is a seemingly magical process of transformation, creation, or combination. And I think that's this business of engaging patients is sort of like going back to some old or early alchemy concepts to me. And also my former colleague, the dean of the engineering school at the University of Wisconsin, once said something that really struck me. Paul Piercy said, if the 20th century was about thinking the world apart, then the 21st century must be about thinking it back together again. And I think that's the the sacred mission of this engaging patients in research is it's bringing us back together again. And that I honor you for that work, and I remain available to you to help you do it, because it seems a worthy pursuit. So thanks, questions, hates, hopes, loves, and fears. Throw things at me.
We're going to take 5 minutes for questions. So while people are coming up to the mic, I just have a comment that is based on your talk and going to the PCORI meeting and learning about how academic researchers have struggled with developing relationships with patients. And it occurred to me, family practice is all about relationships. We see our patients sometimes from cradle to grave, and there are some examples of ongoing relationships in at least the Colorado network. And it just suddenly occurred to me, maybe we have a leg up over some of our colleagues in developing, and I just wondered if you had any comments about that thought, whether has any validity or not.
I think that's definitely true, both because of the relationship